Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our Black Studies speaker series. I want to start by thanking the originators, in big quotes, of this project, Jennifer, Milka, Danita, and Taylor, who helped organize this series beginning just over a year ago or more. And thank you to our brilliant panelists for joining us virtually. This is the final iteration of the Black Studies Speaker Series on queer and quare religions. The speaker series was developed alongside the minor in Black Studies and is intended to illuminate faculty, staff, and student work in our program and think through how Black studies and Black politics breach university walls. This means, of course, thinking about Black studies as diasporic in method and theory, and also working out how Black studies imagines collective liberation. That is Black and non-Black liberation through radical relationality. The 2022-2023 speaker series attends to all of these nuances, gathering brilliant scholars who challenge us to grapple with Blackqueer and Blackqueer faith and faithlessness across the Black diaspora in various and varying disciplines and in differing intellectual landscapes. I'm very excited for the final panel on Blackqueer and Blackqueer religions, Blackqueer Afro-Indigeneities, and non-religious movements. I also want to take this moment to share my appreciation for the work that Jennifer has put in and bringing these panels together and threading together these amazing ideas and scholars that have been really just incredibly explosive for me and mind-blowing. I've been on the sidelines, and while Jennifer often invites me into the conversation as a co-organizer, she did the work of dreaming, writing, and actualizing these discussions, and also situating them in the future, which is so exciting to think forward to. My mind has been opened up and reshaped by the conversations Jennifer has curated. These Black queer religions and queer ways of being sit with you, they live with you, and they reconfigure the contours of community, love, and belonging. This has been a truly beautiful and generous and incredibly creative series, and I think a really subversive way to locate Black studies at Queen's. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for all your work, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It has been indeed my honor and pleasure to be a part of this project. And I thank you for the ways that you have supported and accompanied me and this work. And I too am excited about this iteration of our conversation. Today is the fourth in this series of conversations on Black queer religions, and we have heard the voices of Black queer practitioners and scholars of Buddhisms, Christianities, and Islams. Today, we will hear the voices of those who study and practice queer, Afro-Indigenous, and Black queer new religious movements. Charles H. Long clarifies the existential stakes of the religious for Afro-diasporic people, somehow situated in the wake of the transatlantic slave trade and colonization. He writes of those caught in this crush. The oppressed must deal with both the fictive truth of their status as expressed by the oppressors, that is their second creation, and the discovery of their own autonomy and truth, their first creation. The locus for this structure is the mythic consciousness, which dehistoricizes the relationship for the sake of creating a new form of humanity, a form of humanity that is no longer based on the master-slave dialectic. The utopian and eschatological dimensions of the religions of the oppressed stem from this modality. We who trace the possibilities of our ontic dignity, freedom, and wholeness through retentions and recreations of ways we know only through intuition and tradition, know too that our futures depend upon our faith and practice. Our amulets, ointments, and holy oils, medicines made of herbs gathered from bushes and grocery store adaptations, baths, sacrificial offerings to and remembrances of our ancestors, invocations to the living, libations, spirit-filledness, song dances, worship, names, and namings are but a few of the gifts we carry and recreate through sacred community practices that cannot be taken away. These can, however, be forgotten and neglected. And two, in remembering, we affirm how we could see before and can see again as Mother, the divine. How we could see before and can see again something new through Ezelie's mirrors. How we could see before and can see again the Dagara gatekeepers who, as Somé puts it, live a life at the edge between two worlds, the world of the village and the world of the spirit. How we could see before and can see again national possibilities together, as Diane Stewart and Tracy Hucks might put it. So we wrestle today with the intersection of Afro-Indigeneities and queerness, new religious movements and Black queerness, considering again the value of a naming of our own, quare, for what it is to be Black, queer, and religious in various ways. Through today's panel, we remember and tend to this part of our garden that we may be refreshed through perennial ontic recreation with our dignity, freedom, and wholeness. And so, as E. Patrick Johnson describes and defines it, quare includes Black materiality, excess, and the religious, and those who are committed to struggle against all forms of oppression, racial, sexual, gender, class, religious, etc. So with that, I just want to thank you again, Catherine McKittrick, and thank you, Daniel McNeil, Milka Njorge, Taylor Snack, Taiwa Kalitu, Brima, Danita Arthurs, Scott Fitzpatrick, Claire Grady Smith, as well as the Religious Coalition of Reproductive Choice and the Black Studies Collective, the Department of Gender Studies and the School of Religion, and Cultural Studies at Queen's University, who have all contributed to the success of this series in different ways. I too acknowledge that we join you from the unceded land of Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Mississaugas of the Credit, and Chippewa, and the Wendat people. And we indeed have a responsibility not only for our own ontic dignity and freedom and wholeness and justice, but for that of those and all of those who have been in this crush. So with that, let me present our guests to kick off today's conversation. First, we have and we'll hear from Omiseke Tinsley, who is the professor of Black Studies and Black Studies at University of California, Santa Barbara. Motivated by love for boundless Black femme creativity, her research focuses on queer and feminist Caribbean and African American performance and literature. She recently completed her manuscript entitled The Color Pink, Black Feminist Love and Criticism, which explores Black femme aesthetics of resistance in the Trump era. Earlier monographs include Beyonce in Formation, Remixing Black Feminism, Ezelie's Mirrors, Blackqueer, Genders, and the Work of the Imagination, which is the winner of the 2019 Barbara Christian Prize in Caribbean Studies, and Thieving Sugar, Eroticism Between Women in Caribbean Literature. She has published articles in journals including GLQ, Feminist Studies, Yale French Studies, and Small Acts, and is a contributor to Time, Ebony, The Advocate, and Huffington Post. We also have with us J.T. Rohn, who is the Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Geography, and Andrew Mellon Chair in the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University. Rohn's first book, Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life and the Politics of Place, is out since January on New York University Press. He is currently a social science fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study. Welcome. We also have with us Meredith Coleman Tobias, she, her, hers, who is an assistant professor of religion, race, and ethnicity in the Americas at Mount Holyoke College. She specializes in Caribbean and North American iterations of African Atlantic religious cultures. She is specifically interested in contemporary religious migrations, which she began to study during her tenure as a Fulbright Fellow in Barbados, 2009 through 2010. Her current research project focuses on Sobonfu Somé, a recently deceased Burkinabe spiritual teacher and leader based in Sacramento, California, investigating Somé's ritual work and mission in Western countries over the last 2 decades. She examines African and non-African descendants' intentional practice of Dagara spirituality in North America as a lens through which to understand historical and contemporary Africana religious formations. She is writing a comprehensive spirito-biographic manuscript documenting Somé's life and work. She brings to her research a background in community theater and interrogations of performance, placemaking, and knowledge reproduction significantly inform her understanding of religious communities. Meredith earned her BA from Spelman College and MDiv from Yale Divinity School, PhD from Emory University. Lyndon Gill, Lyndon K. Gill, whom we also welcome, and welcome Meredith, Dr. Coleman Tobias, is an associate professor in the departments of African and African Diaspora Studies, Anthropology, and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Gill's first book, Erotic Islands, Art and Activism in the Queer Caribbean, was published by Duke University Press in 2018. Welcome, Dr. Gill. And today moderating our conversation is Dr. Bianca Bushama, who is the 2022 to 2023 recipient of the postdoctoral fellowship in Black feminist thought at Queen's University. She was also awarded the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council doctoral fellowship while completing her PhD at the University of California, Los Angeles in gender studies. After this fellowship year, she will begin her appointment as an assistant professor in the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University. And she has published a book review of Brittany C. Cooper's Beyond Respectability, The Intellectual Thought of Race Women in Antipode, a radical journal of geography, and is currently revising an article for the Journal of Canadian Studies, special issue on Black Studies in Canada. In her book manuscript, Arousing Freedoms, Reimagining the Haitian Revolution through Sensuous Marronage, she re-narrates the Haitian Revolution through Black feminist and Black queer epistemologies and methodologies, disrupting the authority of the colonial archive and of prevalent masculinist framings of insurgency discourses. She explores the ways in which embodiment, labor, sensuousness, spirituality, marronage, resistance, and alternative sexualities and genders reimagine the edicts of freedom and Black liberation. We are in for a treat today, and so I'm so excited to welcome each and every one of you, and I turn things over to Dr. Bushama.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, Catherine, for giving me the privilege to moderate this panel. I hope everybody's as excited as I am. I'm a big smiler, so I'm really excited. And you know, when I was presented with the opportunity to moderate this panel, I swear it was nothing short of a queer spiritual revelation. So Jennifer spoke a little bit about my research, and through those threads, you know, I think it's important to say that Dr. Tinsley and Dr. Gill are generously seasoned throughout my project, in part informing my methodology of reading voodoo as an archive, and also further queering or queering the notion of the erotic. Reading Dr. Coleman Tobias and Dr. Roan's interventions has in turn also piqued my spiritual, my intellectual, but also a very spatial and geographical queer and quare curiosities and the different possibilities that they can engender. reflecting on the use of the provocation of queer, or rather the queering of Afro-Indigenous and new religious movements. This panel brings forward the complex yet generative function of the term, contending with the difficulties of translating Black freedom processes through colonial languages. This panel makes room for creating liberatory reading practices, right? That tie in Black femme folks to the divine, that revel in the possibility of conjuration and hoodoo space, that transcend the normative language of acceptance, affirmation, love, and tolerance, and that calls for a rooted spiritual approach to African diaspora studies. So without further ado, I'll introduce the rest of the panel. I do want to make a quick note, though, that Dr. Tinsley, unfortunately, will have to leave us at 4:15, but our conversation will continue till 5 p.m. And so without further ado, please, Dr. Tinsley, the Zoom stage is all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that amazing introduction to the panel and for being part of this, Bianca. And I just want to really echo the thanks to Jennifer for putting this amazing panel together and for being flexible and finding a way to include me. I really wanted to be here in conversation with you all today, and I'm so happy that I get to be. And I am just going to speak real briefly. I want to turn this over to my very brilliant junior colleagues whose words I'm really looking forward to. Just to introduce myself a little bit, my first name is Omisheke, and it's a name that I received in 2005 when I was initiated in the Yoruba tradition as a daughter of two waters, Oshun and Yemaya. And I am a practitioner of many years in kind of creative ways of Yoruba-based spiritualities. I'm also the author of a book that was published in 2018 called Azili's Mirrors, Imagining Black Queer Genders, I think is the subtitle. I always get my subtitles wrong. But that book is very much about engaging Azili, who's the primary feminine spirit in the Haitian pantheon, not as a deity, but as a repository for Black Atlantic understandings of the expansiveness and abundance of creativity of Black queer genders and sexualities, right? And I want to start with that, but also say I'm not going to talk about any of that today, although I'm happy to answer questions about it and all of that. After writing Azili's Mirrors, I wrote two books that are trade books, but that people understand to be a little bit different from my work in Azili's Mirrors. And people sometimes ask, you know, you wrote a book all about spirit, and then you wrote a book about Beyonce, right? And where did spirit go? And then in November, the fourth book came out, and that's another book about Black popular culture. And so these very few words I'm about to share with you are really an answer to the question, where has spirit gone in my work and my understanding? So in 2022, I published a book called The Color Pink: Black Femme Art for Survival. It opens with a tribute to E. Patrick Johnson's definition of queer. It's my definition of Black feminist, F-E-M-M-E-I-N-I-S-T, with apologies, love, and reverence to Alice Walker and E. Patrick Johnson. 1, noun, a Black identified member of the LGBTQIA+ community who embodies resistive femininity, believes the dismantling of misogynoir, femmephobia, and transmisogyny are necessary for Black freedom, knows that Black freedom is necessary for the dismantling of misogynoir, femmephobia, and transmisogyny, can be cis or trans, binary or non-binary, AFAB, assigned female at birth, or AMAB, assigned male at birth, is creative with race, gender, and sexuality, recognizing that creativity is not a luxury for those of us who are Black, queer, feminine, and never meant to thrive. 2, adjective, loves other Black femmes erotically and politically, practices collaborative solidarity, recognizes the reality of non-binary vaginas and biologically femme penises, knows love is a bustling highway and not a one-way street. 3, adjective, unapologetically Black and beautiful, enjoys roses while they're still here, loves STAR and STAR, street transvestite action revolutionaries, loves love, loves themselves regardless. 4, feminist, with 2 M's, is to feminist as pink, P-Y-N-K, is to pink. The color pink explores Black femme aesthetics of resistance in the Trump era, which may or may not be done, engaging 2017 to 2020 cultural production that colorfully imagines Black femme freedom in the stark white face of its impossibility. It's a book I wrote after I lost my faith in saints, orishas, law, and all things religious. I may or may not be regaining that faith, but that's another question. However, I wrote this book with full, unabashed, and abundant faith in the power of Black femme creativity. Queer was not useful to me mostly as a term in the work I did for Pink or the work I do now. Yet it is profoundly useful to me as a model for how to create linguistic space to reflect my changing understanding of what ties humans to the divine, for how to continue to become, as E. Patrick puts it in his definition of queer, quote, one who thinks and feels and acts, and sometimes acts up, committed to struggle against all forms of oppression, racial, sexual, gender, class, religious. In some of my scholarship, I use the language of religion of Haitian Vodou and the Loi Iziri to talk about the explanatory powers of principles of femininity and imagination that rewire our senses, quote, through concrete, unruly linkages forged around pleasure, adornment, competition, kinship, denial, illness, shared loss, travel, work, patronage, and material support, end quote. In my scholarship now, I use profane and vernacular language like Black feminist, Black pussy power, non-binary vagina, freedom dreaming to talk about this same divine work of rewiring. The loving reworking of language to hold our shifting understandings of what makes Black, gender, and sexual creative folks simultaneously human and divine, which E. Patrick does by the simple mouth-opening shift of a vowel, is what I hold from queer in all of my work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer, Catherine, Bianca, and my co-panelists. I'm very honored to be a part of this and looking forward to this conversation. I've been at work on an experimental short film plot. It uses visual and sonic palimpsests to draw out the myriad meanings and uses of historic rural Black landscapes, especially churchyards, and the expression of intra and interregional familial and collective identities. It centers footage by cinematographer Hugh Watson of my family's own return to the graveyard for my grandmother's birthday, layered with sound and with dance scenes and other sacred landscapes shot with Johnny Cruz Mercer. In part, the film, as I mentioned, is inspired by a double loss, which I think says something about the queer approach to my work, to honor and also to challenge these spaces. By double loss, I mean the physical structure of my home church, St. John's Baptist in Desha, Virginia, during a 2015 tornado, and the trauma of that sudden loss of the most permanent place of my father's family's social and cultural reproduction, memories of funerals, weddings, dedications, hide and seek, fellowship, held and lingering in its sweet smelling air, in the thick red carpet, the creaky boards and pews, the old burgundy leather bound hymnals and Bibles. The second loss happened 2 years after that during a Friends and Family Day celebration held by the congregation in another church's sanctuary before they were able to rebuild. During the service, while I was still reeling from the loss of the church and in that same year of my father, the new pastor at St. John's made anti-trans and anti-queer commentary that didn't have anything to really do with even a central message. So it appeared to me to be just quotidian in deployment, a kind of reflexive and unthinking nastiness that I'm far too grown and into my own sexuality and all that to deal with. So I haven't attended services inside the rebuilt building, and I'm not sure I will, except in a family funeral or maybe even my own. That is part of my queer relationship, is in this context as a vexed outsider. But I also haven't abandoned this site in total, since it is a place of mourning, and my father, my grandmother, my uncle, my cousins, and probably I will someday be interred and perhaps even remembered there. My embrace of this landscape and its repulsion of me has tasked me with more engagement about the differentiated power sources and flows that compose rural Black Baptist church landscapes. In the absence of the old building and the falling away of my connections to other aspects because of their direct association and employment with queer antagonistic pulpit, I come to embrace the churchyard. The film is, I think, a salve in part for myself to nurse, if not completely heal the wounds of what's gone in this doubled layering, but what's also still tangible in thinking about the ground itself. Rural Black churches and the larger landscape of which they are a part is, of course, dominated in its symbolic and often literal center by the pulpit, extending to affiliated sites of sermonic enactment and charismatic power. This formulation is patriarchal and is symbolized in the steeple of the cross, the all masculine trinity, as a metaphysical and accompanying vernacular geographic feature of these rural, primarily Black Baptist congregations. The centrality of this formation of power shaping rural Black congregational life, of course, can't be understood outside of the context of the turn to male sermonic singularity as part of the response to and rapid transition and tumultuous transition from the fleeting freedom of Jubilee to the rationalization of political force through the parliamentary enacted in relation to the historical Republican Party during Reconstruction, and then the subsequent violent subjugation and repression entailed with the reinstallation of white supremacist hegemony, and from the 1870s through Virginia's readjuster movement collapse in the 1880s to the full instantiation of Jim Crow by the early 20th century. Of course, as Elsa Barkley Brown's account of these transformations in Black post-emancipation congregations in Richmond, nearby to my own home community centers, the repression of Black political and public discourse after Reconstruction gave rise to the region's churches, in the region's churches, to the pulpit's seemingly inexhaustible authority in many of these congregations, displacing multi-preacher traditions to a single pastor model, diminishing women's access to ecclesiastical and other forms of power, and undercutting the radical democracy of many early post-emancipation congregations in the name of social advancement vis-a-vis a white supremacist state. And here, of course, I'm also building on Erica Edwards' critical charismatic scenario work. So on one level, the burial ground extends this form of power, encompassed as part of the terrain of the pulpit through the officiation of funerary rites related to either the eulogy or graveside pronouncements over the dead before remains are returned to earth. On a quotidian level, however, it is the site of mourning, which is an unwieldy, often querying formulation of individual and collective that are not fully subject to the sermonic or subsumed to its authority in the pulpit block, even as they are influenced by it, and where there might be some what I'm interested in here is the extra sermonic power, the discomportment embodied in a nasty cry, a shout, and many other formulations. Historically, many rural funerals, especially, were held at the graveside and included demonstrative worship in ways that challenged the monovocal execution of the rites, and often included powerful weeping, wailing, and singing that overwhelmed the sermonic singularity. The burial ground is also, of course, shadowed and invested as a site of queer potential through the traditions of hoodoo. Here, a designation that I hope is sort of captured in the film unintentionally through family footage. But here, as a designation, hoodoo naming myriad local and regional practices of heterodox, cosmological, ecological, social orientation, enacted through the active pursuits of shifts in the physical and metaphysical terrain through conjuration. Hoodoo is sometimes in direct refutation of the sermonic block's potentially dictatorial centrality and its expressive hegemony through a patriarchal exegesis of the Bible. It is a formation of power generated from the dead and from the ground itself. It's an outlook that grounds itself in power, in the power of the terrestrial and the ancestral, rather than solely from on high. It's earthly, and therefore it introduces a queer alternative source of power, often feminized, often marked as best outside the purview of meaningful collectivity, and worst as a scourge with the potential to undermine the very basis of the church. It introduces a form of rogue spirituality and materialism that at once views the elements as animated by vital force, but also views conjuration as part of the labor of disordering or reordering or queering social cosmological arrangements. So I'm interested in pondering this queer potential and really trying to show it through film, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Many thanks to Jennifer for their invitation to this space. I am a Black queer scholar of African Atlantic religious traditions. I'm also a Lukumi initiate practitioner who is deeply devoted to my Black Baptist heritage. To use the term coined by religious historian Tracy Hucks, I am a Yoruba Baptist, and my religious practice embodies the multi-religious belonging that scholars like theologian Monica Coleman have elaborated upon in recent years. In some ways, I'm bluntly queer, emerging from the folkloric up South Africana traditions that have purpled feminism's lavender and blackened queerness's disruptions over the last few decades. Polyreligious practices are not new phenomena for scholars and practitioners of African Atlantic religions. Over 400 years of African encounter with the so-called New World has produced multiple Black religious allegiances and practices. And these encounters are the most obvious bridge with my current scholarly engagement. So I research, write, and teach about what I term a Dagara religious diaspora in the North American, among other Western contexts. Theorizing Burkina-based spiritual teacher Sabanfu Somé as a purveyor of a distinct West African religious diaspora in the Western Hemisphere, my project historicizes the North American landscape as a long-standing locale for multi-sided global religious imaginaries. Central to my ethnographic exploration is documenting how Westerners for more than a century have sought out Indigenous teachers from North America and Asia to supplement their mono-religious sensibilities. Like many contemporary spiritual celebrities like Deepak Chopra, Iyanla Vanzant, Jamie Sams, who champion Indigenous teachings as the axis of a rhetorical authenticity, my research finds that Sabanfu Somé introduced to North America a newer trope of exotic spiritual authority, an African woman immigrant. Somé's work advanced the spiritual knowledge of her Burkina Faso home and her ethno-linguistic group, the Dagara, as instructive to Westerners. Until her recent death at the top of 2017 transition, Somé continually drew a mostly white North American middle-class following of cis women to ritualize life phenomena such as birth and death, working alongside various other spiritual but not religious teachers of ethnic new religious movements. Sabanfu Somé facilitated the emergence of a white American following discursively housed in Ghana, Burkina Faso. But in addition to this like public-facing following, the primary focus of my study, I also document how African-American religious nationalists more tacitly found utility in the publication of Sabanfu Somé. So what further distinguishes Sabanfu Somé as a spiritual teacher, I theorize, was her ability to galvanize such unique slices of the nation's demographic. We don't often see the white seekers in spaces with Akan and Yoruba practitioners of our contemporary era, right? We don't see them ritualizing in the same ways, but in the Somé space, we did, and we still do. Not many spiritual teachers can boast the loyalties of these two ideologically divergent populations. More specifically, venturing to the United States' Pacific Northwest for field work, the transgender, bi, pansexual, lesbian, and gay people who ritualize often with Somé, white and BIPOC, make her rituals primarily a space of spiritual home, spiritual concomitants. I've stood beside these practitioners as they cry, they scream and pray during her grief rituals. They gathered around Sabanfu as a venerated spiritual teacher, and they doted on her, massaging her shoulders, rubbing her feet, providing food and drink. Well, my initial hunch was that these students make rounds on the spiritual but not religious retreat circuit and kind of fashioned Sabanfu as kind of a Sacramento bell, to use the language of religious historian Miranda Manigault Bryant. I soon realized that Somé offers something unique to LGBTQ plus communities and participation in a Neo-African religious culture. In the spirit of intimacy, ancient teachings, and the ways of relationships, Sabanfu Somé identifies the Dagara gatekeeper and as a person who lives at the edge between two worlds, the world of the village and the world of spirit. Somé identifies the necessity of this, quote, precarious position for village life and names Western LGBTQIA folks along this continuum with specific religio-social roles that enable the thriving of communities. In this way, Somé, to me, transcends the normative language of acceptance, affirmation, love, and tolerance that is typical to queer inclusion in hetero and cisnormative progressive religious spaces. She names queerness as vital to ritual survival. And I think that this is life-giving language and her unique contribution. A queer injunction then becomes how this phenomenon, different points of entrance into Dagara spiritual practice, revises the discourse amongst the African-American nationalists who were also her followers. They were in the space, but as many of my interviews proved, not ideologically on board with the ways that the gatekeeper, an indigenous Dagara concept, upends androcentric, hetero, and cisnormative assertions of Black families and nation building. So the next axis of my work interrogates this possibility in the afterlife of Somé's movements and reflexively looks to my own Black queer existence as an autoethnographic node of Africa-inspired spiritual evolution and responsibility. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I just want to first, it's an honor to be here and to be part of this conversation, and to thank Dr. Jennifer Leith, the originators, as Catherine called them, the Department of Gender Studies for the invitation. Am I back, Scott? Something happened.
You're back, Lyndon.
Thanks, Catherine. Sorry. Zoom had a
You look
hiccup.
great. You look great.
Sorry about that, everybody. Sorry about that. My Zoom has been having a moment. But again, like I was saying, to thank Dr. Lee, thank Dr. McKittrick, for this part of this foundational conversation. So you're brilliantly and bravely curating to, as Catherine says, to subversively set Black queer spirituality as the cornerstone of the Black Studies program you're building at Queen's University. So it's really an honor to be part of this transnational trans-faith revival, I call it, the queerest, Blackest revival I've been a part of in a long time. And so I also promise that what I'm about to say is not meant to be shady, but is rather truly meant as a theoretical proposition that I hope to have challenged and that I hope Zoom will allow. So if I go out again, I'll come back and try to catch where I am. But the proposition I offer, a proposition in defense of anti-Blackness and the sacred. So before I read my eulogy for Black studies, I want to celebrate a lesson its afterlife might teach us about rootedness, which is in fact the same lesson quare teaches us by listening closely and respectfully, even to our homophobic elders and ancestors. Sean Crowley on the panel about Black queer Christianities in the same series reminds us that quare is a regional vernacular redeployment of queer in a North Carolinian African-American tongue of a certain generation. This is significant not because quare and queer are so conceptually distinct. They are just shades of each other, as folks have said. After all, as feminists to womanists, lavenders to purple, or as performative shifts in register from the direct verbal insult of reading to the indirect or extra discursive insult of throwing shade. Quare proves a significant intervention to the extent that it reminds us to resist the tempting universalizing impulse of queer. If queer is in its originary formation indeed odd, bent, off-kilter, non-normative, excessive beyond conventional categories, then quare does not shift that meaning fundamentally by imploring us to read queer also through the lenses of race, class, and cultural/regional context. Instead, Johnson and his grandmother root that meaning in place, in time, and in the soil under Southern tongues. I bring what Johnson calls a culture-specific positionality to the fore, in large part because its absence in the then, and sometimes still, conventional queer studies is the very same absence I find in conventional Black studies. In fact, Johnson's critique of the totalizing and homogenous formation of identity endemic to a parochial queer studies also holds for the interventionist interdisciplinary project we are increasingly again calling Black studies. So let's begin the eulogy. A significant part of the theoretical foundation for my second book, now tentatively titled Sacred Sensorium, Spiritual Baptism and the Queer Afterlife of Faith, rests upon what seems like inconsequential semantics at first listen, but actually reveals a significant shift in the direction of a transdisciplinary project that has been variously called Negro Studies, African-American Studies, Afro-American Studies, Africana Studies, African Diaspora Studies, Black Studies, and more recently, Black Study, to name only a few iterations. The proposition here is in alignment with an Afro-pessimist teleology that traces the origin of Blackness as a dehumanized, violence-constituted racial category, largely to the Middle Passage. Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being has become a queer standard-bearing flagship text of this neo-secularist approach, in contrast to an African Diaspora Studies or Africana Studies approach, whose teleology points at once towards the African continent as point of origin, coeval conversation partner, and potential future world for people of African descent globally. This difference in approach has until now not been identified as an important distinction in what have become camps usually divided along Afro-pessimist versus Afro-optimist lines. But I contend that the distinction between Black studies and African diaspora studies is to a significant degree about situated and spiritual relevance embedded within terminology. In other words, one important way we resist the Academy-sanctioned secular celebration of Black as a rootless collective category, whose endpoint, I think, is the antisocial Afro-pessimist conceptual cul-de-sac, is by insisting on a spiritual attentiveness that recenters African diaspora as our historical, cultural, and religious frame of reference. I'm interested in a kind of anti-Black escape route where anti-Blackness takes on a more subtle semantic meaning, if you will. Sacred sensorium attends to spirituality and the faith that undergirds it while also taking root in a particular religious tradition, the spiritual Baptist faith. This is an amalgamated religion that formerly enslaved people brought with them in the 19th century from the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country of the United States South to the South Central region of Trinidad, the southernmost island of the Caribbean. In this respect, it is a direct inheritor of the intellectual and creative legacy of Harlem Renaissance novelist, playwright, essayist, and too often dismissed anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston, whose ethnographies investigated this linguistic, cultural, and spiritual relationship between the US South and the Caribbean region. Dr. Irma McLaurin has convincingly proposed that Hurston is not only central to the emergence of African diaspora anthropology, but also a critical early godmother of what she calls Black studies, but I'm more precisely calling African diaspora studies writ large. And yet, recognizing Hurston also as an important point of origin for African diaspora studies brings attention to thematic and methodological legacies that are central not only to my book, but also should be recentered in what has become a nonchalantly secular, US-centric, slavery-focused historical document and contemporary data-driven archive of Black life, delimited to the flesh and blood, the natal and the nationalist, the tangible and the material. If from its earliest conceptualization, African diaspora studies is as spiritually attentive as Hurston is in her ethnographies and novels, is as spiritually attentive as Hurston is in her ethnographies and novels, then a transculturally attentive and transnationally rooted centering of faith is also an invitation to the demise of Black studies and a celebratory ninth night return to the place where Zora Neale Hurston buried the navel string of our transdiscipline. Thank you.
Woo! That was amazing. Thank you so much to all the panelists. So many things come to mind in terms of the different ways that you're articulating the Black radical potential of queerness, but articulated in very different ways, in specific ways that really tend attentions to geographies and space, relationship to land, relationship to death. I also feel there's a particular way that you all highlight how the radical potential of queerness is opposed to the foundational and colonial traits of Western religiosity that really bifurcate the idea of spirituality and sexuality and embodiment, which also is sort of like a parallel reformulation of enlightenment. I'm thinking here of a Cartesian sort of mind-body split, and how the edicts of all the types of queer spiritualities and religiosity that you're bringing forward in these traditions really understand the sensorial, the embodiment, the sensuality, the roots of these practices, and how they become productive sources of knowledge, production, and structures of collective remembering, of collecting resistance, and of Black liberation. So thank you all so much. I would like to start with a few questions. And since Dr. Tinsley is leaving us early, I would love to start with you, Doctor, and perhaps open up the dialogue if anybody else wants to jump in after this question. But yeah, let's see. So Dr. Tinsley, since your research and your presentation examine a particular time frame, the Trump era, which is, as you mentioned, it's ongoing in different ways. But since you're examining sort of the how the impossible is made possible through Black femme aesthetics of resistance, I wonder how you engage with notions of queer temporality or even quare temporality. And additionally, being a fan of your work, I know that you also rework some of Jackie Alexander's concept of time with a capital T. And so I'm wondering if perhaps an idea of spirit time works better than this queer framework to sort of think of time and temporalities in a more generative type of way.
Thank you for those reflections and for that question. So the color pink is, I said, it's about the Trump era, right? But it's also, it begins with a letter to Alice Walker, and the idea that in fact we are in loops, right? And that a lot of what we saw in the Reagan years, for example, right, are tools that we need to think through about how Black femme of center folks can dive into language and the imagination to resist the living deaths that are supposed to be our lives, right? And also with the understanding of, and it ends with a letter to my child, right, who's also a Black queer person, in the hope that, in the fear that what we needed in the Trump era, which Alexis Pauline Gumbs beautifully renamed as the tourmaline ascendancy. So for shorthand, in honor of the filmmaker, the tourmaline ascendancy, right? How we call on a future that is also the present and the past, where all Black lives can be abundant, right? And it is an understanding of time that is spirit time, but that I don't name in that way, right? And that is interested in it is very much in line with a lot of Alice Walker's projects. Of course, recently she's now come out with some terrible transphobic things. So not that particular project, but of thinking through how, you know, our mother's gardens, and also to pay homage to Zora and Zora Neale Hurston, in line with what Lyndon is saying, right, are always what we need for the present and the future.
Thank you so much. And just because I'm keeping track of time, I know this question is about time. I wonder if anybody has any provocations or comments to perhaps bounce with Dr. Tinsley before she leaves, or I could jump in with another question that perhaps can foment more conversation, but just wanted to put that out there to the panelists. Oh, Catherine, yes, please.
I don't know if I'm allowed to speak, but I know that Tinsley's leaving soon, so I want to just join in for 1 second. I wonder, you know, if JT and Omisaki can talk a little bit about the graveyard and the sacred space, because there are connections there of Walker going to Zora Neale Hurston's grave, and the kind of patriarchal colonization of Hurston's work by Gates, and Walker's call to, you know, feminize that space in some ways. That might not be the right word, but then JT is really interesting thinking about the plot and the church, and how these sacred spaces are tethered to another kind of geography that can't quite wrestle free of you know, this kind of other prevailing knowledge system that is bound to these questions of like a mono-religious patriarchy. So thank you.
Not to shirk my, thank you so much for that question. And I don't want to be a question dodger, but I feel like I would like to pass to JT first, since I don't think about graveyards centrally, more about gardens, and then I can follow up.
That's okay.
Yeah, I think I saw this kind of provocation online recently, maybe about a year ago, actually, when I started to edit the film, that I think it was, a kind of a roundabout way that folks were calling to center life, but saying that basically you can't use the graveyard to cultivate anything. And, in terms of my own traditions, I won't speak in a global sense or even a diasporic sense. We don't grow food where you where you bury folks, but to write it off as a provision ground, I think there's so much that is integrated between something like a garden and something like the spaces where people are interred, and in the sense of it, being tethered through sort of Black grounding and a partial indigenization, in terms of, at least in relation to the specific part of Virginia that I'm discussing. And I think it's in real tension with the other forms of power that we know and that are pretty self-evident and loud in relation to rural Black congregations, in particular, pastor power and all of that. But I think there are the congregations like the one I discussed, that's my own home church, and that I'm not engaged with. But I should note, and probably, that I've been doing political work with other kinds of congregations that on their face are relatedly, have a similar structure, but beneath that kind of surface are sources of multiple kinds of power that operate. And I think, again, you're always in relation to the kind of charismatic scenario and the violence of that. But I think there are spaces that generatively challenge that formulation, where they are democratic in a sense, and in a way that is generative. And I think I see the project of thinking about this and trying to use film to draw it out as a hedge against what's happening in these rural communities, where, first of all, Black folks don't control any land in any significant way, but also we're being sprayed and poisoned for large industrial operations, both tree plantations and like, chicken food, like grains that go to Purdue or whatever the primary owner of all that stuff is currently. And I think, and also the portfolios of multinationals that are hidden behind LLCs that are adding rural land to their portfolios. And so I'm not willing, those churches and those spaces, they've been the most important hedge, and they represent a trajectory out of the hush arbor that's one of the most important counter forces within that. So I can't abandon it. At the same time, I need to have a queer relationship with it. And I think, again, the film is about drawing us to this understanding that we have a grounded sense of place in relation to these sites, and also what it means that, when taken together, they form a collective form of property. And it's quite different than other forms that are dominating that geography. So I think, and I think those are ways to engage queerly with it, but also to challenge it and to queer it and all of that. So thank you for that question.
So there's a question in the chat for you, Dr. Tinsley. I want to make sure everybody gets in their questions, and we'll trying to moderate this thing. Dr. Tinsley, what has contributed to the wearing off of your faith and Yoruba spirituality?
Thank you for that question.
That's sorry, Immaculée.
Sorry. Thank you. It's a very real question, and I appreciate it. It's not a real intellectual answer that I have. There is some, I think, of anything that you get into, any version of channeling the divine. We channel it through humans, and we're all, like, particularly, Black folk, including Black queer folk, we move through the world with a lot of trauma, and we're complicated, and any spiritual community involves difficulties of how people's humanness comes into the divine. But that's not really what, I just want to recognize that that's a thing, because when I started, it was very like, oh, this is revolutionary, this is going to change everything. And it changed everything, but it doesn't in and of itself undo like the kind of, you know, misogynoir world that we move through. What really happened is, and I've written about this pretty publicly, and Dr. Gill knew me when this was going on. I have a child who's 13, and I got a lot of readings, and that I was supposed to have a second child who was going to be a son, and it was going to be this amazing ceremony for Oshun when he was born. And I was kind of like, I don't know, do I really need a son? Like, does the world really need another Black son to save it? But I listened and I did all the things that I worked really hard, and I had 4 miscarriages, and I could not understand why something would be promised to me and taken away so violently and just devastatingly. And that's also part of being a Black woman, right? Where our rates of miscarriage are at least twice as high as those of anyone else. And where, you know, we know that rates of miscarriage for Black women who have PhDs like myself are the same as for white women who have GEDs, all the things, right? And it was an extremely stressful political time, and that, you know, I carried that stress in my body like all Black people do, and in Texas no less at the time, right? And also, it's been a really long road for me to think about, you know, what other ways that that whatever that divine spirit of femininity is, because I've had like Lakshmi come to me, right? Like whatever that spirit of femininity is, I always seem to find a connection to it. And also to think about ways that maybe sometimes the promises of spirit manifest in the world in unexpected ways. And so I'm not sure where I am with that right now, but I do know 175% that I believe all day, every day in the power of Black femme imagination and creativity. And so if you call that Oshun or Ezili, then like that is still where my faith lies. But I don't know if, you know, I'm Catholic, I'm Yoruba initiated. I have some Hoodoo and Voodoo roots, but I don't know if that's where my faith is, but I also don't know that that's not where my faith is.
Thank you for that question. Lyndon, did you want to jump in?
If I can, may I ask Dr. Tinsley a follow-up question about that? It's a bit of an annoying question. It's, I think, as annoying maybe for you, Omi, as people asking about why this sort of shift to popular culture and seeing and thinking that spirituality has left somehow, as if those two things can't be held together. It's in that same line, and maybe you started to answer it when saying that it shows up in that sort of Black femme imagination and creativity that you still believe in, that is also spirit too. I wonder, I would ask the same question about literature and writing about novels. And it seems like you began to give me that answer in saying the novels and the literature is still there, even in the conversation about popular culture. But I wonder about, have you left novels? Have you lost faith in novels and literature?
That's an excellent question. And you knew me when my name wasn't Omisheke, right? And I was all about novels and poetry, which I still love. And also at UT, when I came to UT and I discovered what, you know, many people have discovered before and since me, that when I was an undergraduate, novels were how, you know, as Barbara Christian said, I knew that I was still alive and could make it through the world, that what I felt was real. And so that's where I started, and it's still a powerful form for me. But at a certain point, I realized that for my students, particularly for my Black women students, music played a similar role. And of course, music and literature aren't, music is poetry, and poetry is music. And also like the period of time that I talk about where I was surviving miscarriages, like Beyonce was the soundtrack to that, right? To reminding me that I still needed to show up and wake up, and that I was powerful every day. And so on the one hand, I'm shifting to what the conversations that I feel, the young people are having these days, shifting to other parts. Part of what I've tried to do is, because the academy doesn't have space for all of us, right? And so, like, how do I show up as a spiritual person, as a person with a sexuality, as a person who does yoga, as a person, right? Like, as a person who likes cats, right? When I'm just supposed to be a talking head. And so how to bring also some of what reminds me that I'm alive into my work, but also the Trump election was a shift for me, because suddenly I wanted to write things that my cousins were going to read, my literal cousins and my figurative cousins, right? And so these conversations, I don't think that it's more accessible than literature, but people perceive it as more accessible than literature, right? And so, I still am a literary scholar at heart, but I'm also other things, and I don't know what I'm going to do next.
All right, thank you for that. So we still have a little bit more time with you, but I want to ask a question that perhaps I have a few, but there's a few in the chat. I'll get to one in the chat, and then I'll go to some of the other ones. So we have this is to the whole panel, and it's coming from Ivania, and the question is, I'd like to first and foremost thank the panelists for their wonderful presentations. I have a general question for the panelists. As a sex work historian, I'm very curious about the role of sex work has played, if it has, in your respective works and in various colonial and non-colonial religious, queer, and queer religious practices. Any provocations with sex work and quare and queer and femininity?
I'll say something. A lot of in my recently published book, Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life and the Politics of Place, I engage the spatial and experiential and other kinds of connections between, and really in Philadelphia is kind of the underground worlds and the set apart and the underground, including the kind of the worlds associated with the sexually disreputable. And I think those two worlds together, especially in the urban context in 20th century Philadelphia, those really articulate values and sense of place that's out of time, or that queers, or that challenges the kind of normative rubric and prescriptions for like urban life in particular. And I think that genealogy comes out of the kind of rural stuff that I've been talking about today, because I think even if you go to certain stuff, like on the kind of ritual calendar of rural Black, ecclesiastical communities, like many of them, like, the kind of August period of mass gatherings and all of that, and revivals and all of that, they were as much about like locating new sexual partners, engaging in play. There's a lot going on. They're a complicated vehicle for all of that, but it's very much a part of it. And I think that what all of that potential was in the rural context, when it gets transposed and translated and transferred and translocated in the context of urbanization, mass urbanization, and movement back and forth, both physically and in a more, in a different kind of sense. Again, they create a different temporal and spatial horizon that I think is underappreciated between those two seemingly very different worlds. And so I think you have like blues singers like Lucille Bogan, you know, talking about they're in Baltimore embracing a certain kind of erotic sovereignty, not necessarily openly in relation to sex work, but in the kind of realm of what's considered sexually disreputable. And the kind of refrain for that, you know, that recording is like, till the cows come home, this ongoing reference point to those other kind of geographies and spaces. So I think they're related, and I think they're part of like I think that the space of sex workers within even narratives of conversion and all of that is critical, and the back and forth. There's a lot. So thank you for that great question.
Okay, I have a question for Dr. Coleman Tobias, but I think it definitely touches on a lot of the relationship to land that we're talking about, relationship to sort of the spiritual understanding, the queerness of the land. And Dr. Coleman Tobias, you mentioned that in your field work with the transgender, pansexual, lesbian, and gay people of the United States Pacific Northwest, they often viewed the ritual space as a primary spiritual home. You've seen them cry, scream, and pray during grief rituals. And it reminded me of different Afro spiritual traditions. Like I mentioned, like I look at voodoo, but just sort of like the ritual space of it that are incredibly tied to the connection to the land. And so I was really wondering if these folks contended or expressed an understanding through creating the ritual space of the importance not only of ties to West African land, but also was there kind of an awareness to perhaps like the indigenous spirit of the United States Pacific Northwest, if there was sort of a linkage of that indigeneity that sort of crossed spatial frameworks.
Thank you for that question. I would love to say yes, absolutely. There was, and I think that Somay's intervention definitely paid homage to indigeneity broadly writ, and also deeply imagined in many Americana spaces. I think there was a way that the category of the indigenous really, I think was a provocation for Somay and her most kind of intimate students. However, I did not see that that then translate into an observance and practice that really centered the First Nations of what we now call the Pacific Northwest. I did not see that in the rituals that I attended. Rather, I think that there was this sense that as opposed to kind of land being grounding and land being the place where ritual happens, portability and mobility as a site really was, I think, a primary way that these practitioners kind of located themselves and understood themselves. Really kind of saying, okay, well, if our teacher is kind of, you know, this kind of binational person who spends half her life in Burkina Faso and half her life on the West Coast of the United States. And she kind of tells us that we have these mobile shrines that we can take there wherever we go. There the sacred is, there we set up shop. Then I think that there was just this kind of sense of like, the sacred is dynamic, and we don't need to kind of save too much time for the land itself, other than where we are in this particular moment. I think there's a deep question around, does that pay a particular kind of disrespect to the very landed and grounded ways that not only First Nations kind of cosmologies really orient themselves, but also the ways that like rural Burkina Faso Dagra folks orient themselves. there's a caveat that I have there, in as much as I think that, there is a way that the land matters, right, in this kind of very specific West African context. But the Burkina Faso Dagara are also moving people, folks who follow the water, folks who follow where whole farming is kind of generative. And in one life, there are many places, not this kind of stereotypic kind of nomadic, something, but really this sense of like, we go where agriculture grows. I think that informs Somay's sense of portability, land in conversation with mobility, but I think that sense of the sacrality of land was lost by the consumerist tendencies of her kind of, spiritual but not religious circuitry, and its kind of capitalist ends.
Thank you so much for bringing so much of the nuances that are sort of happening in these spaces, in these ritual spaces. I think that gives us a lot to think about, and again, really beyond sort of like the Western framework of religiosity and the colonial sort of understanding of that. So let's see. I do have a question for Dr. Gill that I would love to put out there. And, I feel like, again, the conceptual framework of death, it keeps coming out, but you sort of queered it in a different way, speaking of the death of Black studies. And it kind of brought me, whenever I think of death now, for some reason, I'm always on thinking of The Reaper's Garden, Vincent Brown's work, in terms of thinking about how death is simultaneously generative and destructive. And for me, death always kind of assumes a haunting, like a spiritual world and a particular haunting that comes with it. And so in your eulogy for Black studies, I wonder how you're envisioning it still haunting us as we put it to rest, or as we attempt to, and are these hauntings generative? Are they destructive? Can we queer them, or is the queering the actual birth or sort of rebirth of African diaspora studies in the way that you speak of it?
Bianca, thanks. No, that's really smart, because there's a way that killing off of Black studies is a sort of playful, is a playful gesture. But I think what it is also attempting to do, which I hadn't thought about to the level that you're asking me to think through it now, so I'm thinking out loud, y'all, but is to think about death. Part of my frustration with the conversation about death is the sort of secular presumption that death is a finality, that death is the end, right? And that somehow that, and then also a sort of obsession with materiality. So death is the end, and we're somehow sort of focused and fixated on the body, sort of where the body is buried, which also seems like a particular, I mean, and I don't want to, I get myself into trouble going too extreme, but in terms of thinking about particular kinds of memorialization, monument building that is connected to a kind of materiality that doesn't really recognize spiritual ever-presence in a way, right? So I don't really need a headstone. I don't need an obelisk to commemorate my, uncle, grandfather, whoever, even Zora Hurston, for instance, if there's a recognition that her spiritual presence remains with me, travels with me, remains in the spaces where she was and she walked, right, with the people who she was with, right? And so there's that sort of obsession with the materiality that I think is connected to secularism in some way. This is not to say that folks who understand and embrace spiritual worlds that exist beyond the worlds in which the worlds we can see don't also respect materiality and certain kinds of practices and rituals that happen with actual bodies, right? Or that don't mark certain spaces as burial grounds. But there is something about an overemphasis on the materiality and on the finality of death that I find to be part of the legacy of secularism in our thinking. And so if it is that I'm, killing off Black studies or announcing the death of Black studies, it's not a death that's final. So to go back to the sort of queer temporality, that there's this relationship between this spiritual presence, let's say, this afterlife of Black studies that continues to think through, because it's a useful term, because what I also don't want to do is to sort of get rid of the political sort of potential and the Pan-Africanist sort of political organizing posture that Black studies also creates and makes possible diasporically. There's a way that thinking about Black studies in an earlier moment is about a kind of political project, right? That's a transnational product. That's a more explicit political project. It's a decolonial project, right? And so that there's a way that I still want to keep alive, right? So the spirit of all of that bit that's Black studies I want to keep alive, it's this notion that Black studies is somehow, it becomes euphemism for African-American cultural studies. And there's no, even in the ways that that African-American cultural studies is always deeply connected to other Black populations of people who live in the US, but who are not African-American. But then also there's a lack of attention to the specificities of African, like that's what Sean is asking us to look at, like to say that when he says not everyone's great-grandmother says quare, right? That quare, which I felt people often were having trouble with it. I've heard, and you know, I call myself a Yankee daddy and a New Yorker who's living in the Southwest. People say that's not really the South. So JT might come after me for this. But that I say quare, it seems like that's closest to how he wants us to pronounce it. But that is also about recognizing the specificity of African-American cultural multiplicity, which also gets lost when we're talking about this kind of universalized African America that doesn't connect to the African diaspora necessarily, doesn't connect to Afro-Canada. Or Afro-Latin America necessarily. So I want to kill off that version of Black studies that's sort of standing in the way, I think, of the complexity of who we are, but without losing the politics. So you make a good point. I want us to keep alive, and I want there to be a haunting, and that's doing a particular kind of work that I think is valuable to hold on to, the politics part, the social justice part, the decolonial part, but what it might mean to more specifically ground us when we're talking about Black folks and Black studies. Who is it that we're studying? Which cultures, which parts of the US, which regions of the United States, urban, rural, like those sorts of complexities that I think when we say Black studies or we say Black study, it becomes this abstract way of talking about an imposition on Black bodies of a certain kind of way of being in the world that, you know, folks like, oh, my gosh. Oh, Black aliveness. Kevin, Kwashi, pushes us to think about the complexity of that being, which when we're inside of it, it's far more complex than whatever was imposed upon us, right? But to not lose sight of that, right? To not have the sort of outside humanist way of thinking about us that Winter so beautifully elaborates, and a lot of people go to Winter for, that isn't necessarily the way that we were thinking about ourselves necessarily as we were moving through the world. So it's a complicated dance. So yeah, it's a not finality. So it's a not final death. There's the haunting. Some of the haunting is good spirit haunting. Some of the haunting is stuff that we need to exercise, I think.
Yeah, I feel like many are singing that type of eulogy to Black studies. Thank you. Finally, I want to ask a question to Dr. Roan, and then hopefully we can get some dialogue within the panelists if there's questions you'd like to ask, and then finish off with some of the questions we have in the chat. I know Jennifer has a question as well. So Dr. Roan, you speak about how your queer relationship as a vexed outsider, given the changing sort of ministerial demographic that's spouting patriarchal anti-trans sentiment. But you're very careful in highlighting that you haven't lost, you haven't abandoned it. There isn't a canceling, if you will, of the site, of the space. And it really sort of resonated with me because it seemed to me your idea of a queer relationship is really a reformulation of relation. It is a different way to relate to the spirits, the tension of the church, the mourning. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on what a queer reformulation of relation looks in not only within the rural space, but I know you work on urban spaces too, and how those different spaces require different ways of being in relation, and how that queer relationship that you're speaking of in this particular site is perhaps shaping relationality.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think there are a number of power moments within the context of Black religious communities of all kinds, but particularly I'm thinking about churches in the rural context, and also a number of sort of formulations of religious identity and belonging in the context of Philadelphia in the book work. I mean, I think it's critical because I think the violence of repression of post-Reconstruction repression into Jim Crow's consolidation in the U.S. context, and that, being in dialogue with the rise of apartheidism and similar formulations of anti-Black management and all of that in the context of disruptions in the 19th and early 20th century, that I think that the church becomes a vehicle for many different forms of power. And that's about the truncated field of democratic possibility and articulation in the context of political repression and violence. And again, I think that is diasporic in its articulation, the violence, but also the possibilities for other connections and reciprocities and mutualities and other kinds of formulations. And I think like in the urban context, for example, I look at like Father Divine and the Peace Mission movement. And I think, of course, there's Father Divine as this, probably charlatanic figure that is after a certain point, a second coming. We know what kinds of power that are being reproduced in that and what it means in terms of, violence and extraction and all of that. And yet the draw for many of the people that are involved in that space is the communion table. And that's there are sermonic enactments that Divine is engaged in where he tries to renounce that form and source of power. And I think it's complicated. What I'm trying to say is that these sites are the vehicles of like the physical site, but also the kind of relations that are embedded within them are the vehicles of all these tendencies of power. Some that are about making sure that other people eat, some that are about embracing everybody that comes, some that are about enacting power in order to stage a kind of interface with white colonial violence in the state. And those are all different kinds of power. And I think a queer relationship is to disentangle those and to be critical of their configuration, and not to say like let folks off the hook in relation to subsuming the forms of power to that in an ongoing way, but I think in order to generatively have that play out differently and alternatively on a different formulation is to at least for now, artistically for me to engage them in that way. And to recognize that they're living tendencies and they're powerful possibilities that are I think connect to some of Lyndon's points, that connect to other diasporic modes and in different configurations, and that that again think about reciprocity at different scales and possibility at different scales of articulation. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's it was a mouthful of a question, and there was a lot going on, but you really made me think through basically the infinity of possibilities in terms of how we can relate and how we have not even scratched the surface of that can be, you know what I mean? So yeah, I want to open the floor to some of our panelists to perhaps ask one another questions, or if you have questions for like the generally to the rest of the panel, this is the time.
JT, I have a question. At the very beginning of your comments, you talked about kind of the tension between what it means to kind of mine the graveyard near sacred space and kind of being too grown to stand the disrespect of kind of the kind of outcast way that you're theorizing. And I guess my question is around, like, what do you do with that affect? What do you do with that marginal place? And it really comes in some ways out of my own interest in grief and grief rituals and Dagara grief rituals. So that's kind of my conversational bridge. But I mean, it's an open-ended question, because I think I know I found deep empathy in this sense of I want to theorize, and I need the deep roots of the space that at once has given me so much vocabulary and that knows me, and at the same time has also discursively, replaced me, silenced me, erased me. So I'm just curious about that.
Thank you for that, and I appreciate your engagement. Yeah, I think just very practically, there are different levels of a response that I could have. I think very practically, I've like where I tend to that kind of space in a kind of way that is more fully engaged, even fiscally and other ways supportive, is to go to the kind of another church in relation to that space. And I still don't go. Like that's the other part. That's still, but that space is not, that space has an active vegetable ministry that engages 100 or more elders with fresh food during growing seasons. And I've been working with the pastor of the First Baptist Tappahannock, Cornelius Holmes, as well as indigenous folks of the Rappahannock, and like some other folks in that context to do food justice. And so I think part of it is like holding on to this weird form of like communal property that is like where that if you have a buried ancestor there, you can access this space. That's a very unique form of weird in the context of Virginia, where everything is private and everything is, at your own risk, quite frankly. That the fact that you feel like you can enter that space already says that there's something different about that as a form of property. And like the church that I've had the homophobic, transphobic experience in, hearing a sermon, I'm like, my daddy is buried there. I'm going there forever, right? Like I'm going there. So that's part of it. I intentionally choose to not go there when there's anybody else there. And the film shows like how because it's not just me. I think that's the other thing. We have to realize that some of these kind of spaces that embrace Black sermonic tradition, and that has powerful and things that we could condemn about it. And thinking about Spiller's essay on Black sermonics, like it's a complicated field itself. But I think the ones that have embraced a kind of regurgitated white evangelical like orientation, we still have some stake in those spaces. And it's not my ministry to go up in there and try to get them to do anything. But it is what I was going to say is that's alienating for most people, actually. I'm trying to say there are many of my cousins who would not identify as queer, but who don't have a relationship with that orientation either. We go have our church time in the yard together, and we make film about that, and we engage in that way. And then also commit to where the form does hold on to some of its democratic potential and power, where people are feeding each other, where other aspects of this awkward configuration of Black power is queer, is different, and that we can work with. Because I've never felt more embraced in some ways than I have by Pastor Holmes in the kind of relationship at all. And like, we ain't talking about it. I haven't been like, I'm queer. He's about my partner, but I'm not going there. Like, I don't think he cares. He don't care. Right. So anyway, that's my long-winded response, but really thank you for that question and that engagement, Meredith.
So I have a question for the panelists from Melissa. The question is, how does the heart or spirit show up in your work, especially in the oppressive culture of academia that values mind and intelligence over emotional intelligence and spirituality, especially spirituality outside of religious structures?
So the question is, how does the heart of spirit show up in our work functionally? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's heart of spirit in the work, and especially in academia, where a particular time of spiritual and emotional intelligence isn't valued.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can take a stab at it. Like, I feel, the academic study of religion is a bit, wrought, right? Because I think there are those of us, kind of historically, we have those who do theological studies and do it from a space of both practitioner and concern within like an ecclesial concern, and then people who are very interested in religious studies in kind of creating a distance and I kind of live between those worlds, and as much as I'm kind of open about being a practitioner scholar, and that informs how I teach, that informs what I do. And so very, very straightforwardly, I reject this idea that, that the academy doesn't have space for me as a person who takes the spirits seriously, and I lead with that. And then sometimes, so that's kind of a very straightforward answer. But then I also think just in the way of, I wish Dr. Tinsley were still here, in part because I think that she has given us such rich theorization about the ways that spirit kind of informs theory, the way spirit kind of directs how we think about what questions we ask. And certainly, I think if we take that seriously, we take kind of the intuitive spark, the animating impulse, we can call it whatever we want to call it. Those of us who are kind of cosmologically, theologically inclined might call it spirit. And certainly I think that there's a space of possibility there. But I think the possibilities are as limitless as the world of spirit itself, depending on the particular world sense that this person is kind of gesturing toward.
I agree with Meredith, and it feels generous. There's a way that I was gonna approach this that wasn't as generous, Meredith. I appreciate you starting with that, because I think that there's a way of there's two parts of the question. It feels like there's a personal reconciliation. And that's a personal reconciliation that we have to do as, I don't know if you're a Black queer person, but as a Black queer person, this is very familiar to many of us in academic spaces and spaces that really are structured in order to be exclusionary on the best days and violent towards us, perhaps on their worst days, right? And so that there's a way that we walk into these spaces, these academic spaces, claiming space for ourselves in ways that have to be affirmed beyond what the space says about what's possible. So we can bring that same kind of tool to any area of study that the academy doesn't quite appreciate. It's like, well, you don't, I mean, so that's part of the gift of that. It's like, you don't really appreciate the full totality of my being. So that already makes it easy for me to say, okay, if you don't take this other thing seriously, I recognize my own value. So I recognize the value in this, right? So I need to make sure that this is, if that this is spirituality, that this is something that can be brought into the classroom space, into the serious academic conversation, and valued just like I want my own Black queer life to be brought into that space and valued in ways that the institution wasn't set up and structured for. But the less generous, maybe less less personal way to think about it for me was, and I get into trouble with this all the time, I'm getting myself in trouble today too, is that it's saying that and it's not news to anybody here or anyone probably listening, but that the academy, as far as I understand, and I may be wrong, I'm waiting to be corrected, since the Enlightenment has been a secular space, an intentionally, violently, aggressively secular space, right? And so the idea that you're going to bring this conversation into a space that has what's interesting, I was just thinking about that in terms of claiming it as a secular space. For me, why faith is interesting and important is because just like when we think about philosophy or any kind of theory, sort of, what's quote unquote called classical European theory, the presumption that the bodies of the people, the experiences of the people who were writing that theory, Socrates, Aristophanes, Plato, wasn't important for what they were saying, right? That it was that Black feminists have all of a sudden said that our experience and identity is important, and that's an intervention. It's like, no, Black feminists are telling you that we need to even look at the experiences that these sort of classical philosophers were having in their bodies, and that helped to frame the way that Descartes thinks about the importance of the mind over the rest of the body, right? Because he moves through the world in a particular kind of way, in a particular moment, right? So that's the gift of Black feminism, to think about how theory even works from the very beginning, right? So if we can think about the academy then from that moment of the Enlightenment, in terms of structuring itself, that what it has faith in is science, right? It has faith in materiality, right? So that there is faith in the academy. It's just not in the sort of world of things that perhaps cannot be seen or studied or cataloged in a kind of Victorian model, right? And so that offers me an entry point to say, well, this is something that you believe in faith. You have deep belief and deep faith in this structure, this certain I don't know, this ontology, let's say, like this way of thinking about why the world looks the way it does. I have a different structural frame of reference that may include that. I still believe in science, but I also believe in the things that are not observable or trackable. And this is why I love Omi, and Meredith brings Omi to mind, absolutely, because she says that we can think deeply, critically, fiercely about spirit and spirit world creation, and what it means for how how we organize our worlds as people of color, as queer folks. And that isn't antithetical to what the academy is doing. It's just they put their faith in a different place, right? So that helps me to not feel so disoriented, to feel like, oh, you're doing a similar thing. You have faith in, or there's faith in money, right? So that the US, has a deep faith. There's this deep respect and love for billionaires and money and reverence for money, just like I revere my ancestors. Not to say that people don't sometimes do both, right? But that it puts it in perspective. It says, okay, that just means that this is what you are worshiping. Like, Mama Coco says in Our Mother's Gardens, in Shantropy Lewis's documentary, when she says, people talk about, ancestor worship is foolishness, but then when you look at the money, it's all these white folks' ancestors. Like, you are worshiping their ancestors when you're worshiping money, right? That there is a way that their ancestors are in your pocket, walking around with you, right, in your bank account, like, conceptually, right? And so, and not to come down on, we all have white ancestors too, so not to make it that kind of easy and kind of bifurcated, but well, a lot of us do. But it's like, oh, there is still that reverence, that respect for, that faith in, but it may not be the same things that I have faith in. Like, I have a faith in African traditional religions. I have faith in my ancestors. I have faith in the kind of spiritual systems that are both sort of written and connected to, African spiritual practices, but also deep reverence and respect for, Buddhism and Islam and other kinds of spiritual practices, and ways to think about spirituality writ large. Like, I think it's part of what the question is asking too, in terms of my own personal edification. And so, like, that's also bigger than what the academy can hold. in terms of what you need to, like Omi says, to know that we're alive and valuable, right? It's bigger than what the Academy has never been able to hold all of that. But for me, it just feels like, oh, okay, this is an Enlightenment project that has faith elsewhere. And if I'm just looking at faith in a different place, and that's where we help them to see, look, you worship in something, right? You have deep faith in something, but it may not, it's not my African ancestors necessarily or their spiritual practices, but you got some deep faith, and that's important. It doesn't mean we throw it away, but it just means we see it for what it is. Like we read Foucault for, oh, this is how we understand like sexuality in a Euro-American context. We put it in context and say, this is really valuable still, but it's contextual, it's not universal.
JT, any responses for this question?
I think a lot about the challenges, just in general, and between kind of questions of spirituality, Black religious life, and the environmental kind of stuff, really acutely because of the space that I'm in with the IAS and the kind of theme of it being around the environment. And like to Linda's point, there's so many faiths that underwrite all that that no one is willing to really engage. And part of the faith there, and I probably shouldn't say too much, but part of the faith there is in a abiding, low key white centricism, if not just full on supremacist orientation that doesn't view like any kind of, because I think about certain things and like that Black religious traditions, spiritualist traditions, in that queer and not queer, that have stuff to say around new materialisms and stuff having life and all of those kinds of things that are far too often easily cleared from the table as not having any meaning within those, or meaningful traction within those kind of spaces. And I think I'm not looking to resolve none of that. I've come to a place where like there's a way of doing what we need to do intracommunally and in relation to the dialogues, even in the kind of breakdown that you did, Lyndon, around the real tensions and schisms within the discipline of the field, or however we're defining the Black studies or Africana studies or diasporic studies, that are more interested to me to try to get them to get what I'm saying, because I think it's often the faith that Black cultural stuff, community life, histories, traditions have no meaning or bearing in any of that stuff, is also that that Black scholarship don't matter, and I think I don't care about none of that. I think it could be a space of reprieve, actually, to not be to read of the fullness and the richness of our traditions, widely construed and widely understood. So I think, and I don't think that there's a resolution, because I don't think the Academy is, like, as many of us know, is in any way fixable outside of that Enlightenment trajectory and history. It's not resolvable outside of that. And so I think, again, what do we do foot in, foot out? How do we maneuver is a different question, but I don't think, I'm not trying to get them folks to understand Black religious. In fact, I might not want them to understand it. So anyway, thank you.
Right. I think your last comments are really sort of driving home the idea also, like Glissant brings forward in terms of the right to opacity, right? There's a particular way in which, like, there is not a need, there's a particular sacredness that perhaps the Academy does not need to have their hands on. And bring forward, and it's brought forward through other means, sort of like what Dr. Tinsley sort of shows us, but in a particular sort of agenda, opaque agenda. Okay, so there's a question in the chat. We have like 5 minutes to get to that, and then we'll get to the end of we'll finish up our lovely panel that I wish could go on forever. But we have Jennifer here asking, in what ways are the religious spaces you consider dependent on or built in through around Black queer or queer life? And also, how does queer present and cultivate possibilities of Afro-futures in the religious spaces you consider? I can repeat that. It is in the chat as well, but the first one, in what ways are the religious spaces you consider dependent on, built in, through, around Black queer and queer life?
I'll begin and just say that, kind of building on this idea of the gatekeeper, literally, I mean, I didn't kind of walk through the role of the gatekeeper in these Americana rituals. But I mean, this is literally a person who kind of stands guard and kind of holds kind of spiritual, emotional space for someone to grieve, to manifest prosperity, to kind of intend fertility, like all of these ways that people come together and ritualize. These literally need to be folks who are identifying as queer. And so there's a very functional capacity that that Black queer existence I've seen kind of function within these ritual spaces. So may literally singled out people who are identifying as queer to function in these ways. And so there was just like a very pragmatic, you are needed here in order to make the ritual go ontologically, you know? I think we can problematize that as well. I mean, I'm not kind of suggesting that in a kind of utopic, see, we're needed, you know, kind of way, but more so to just say, oh, how, like that for me, that singling out, particularly when it wasn't clear to me how robustly the ritual gathering was kind of thinking through queerness. For me, I mean, in the end, I didn't. In my own work, I don't run with it because I see its problematics right on the surface. And yet, to kind of answer Jen's question, it's there is something with which to contend. And I haven't seen that in other kind of Afro-Indigenous spaces. More specifically, I'm thinking about one ritual moment at an Afrocentric church outside of the metro Atlanta area that really that Somé attended, and said to the people gathered, many of whom I know and understood as queer participants, just because of the folks to whom the event was advertised. Somé said something to the effect of like, come on, you all participate, you all know how to do this. Now, I mean, there was kind of a generic indexing to I think, like an African-American religious nationalist sensibility around, you know, kind of a staid and maybe static African past. But I also think that there was this idea that people carry in their bodies a particular kind of vocabulary similar to this idea of the gatekeeper, and that needed to be mobilized, and it needed Somé's permission to do so. So again, there are these ritual spaces that in many ways are relying on Black queer attendance, possibility, and imagination to kind of catapult the work forward. What that means for a future, I'm unclear. Like I think I feel a bit settled, sad, and maybe dystopic about the future of that because of the inherent problematics within it. Nonetheless, I can't think of a similar ritual space, and that's why I kind of invoke it here.
Lyndon, JT, any last thoughts in terms of answering this question?
You know, the good doctor then set down difficult question for us as on the way out, to work through and think about. So something I'm still chewing on. And Jen, I'm gonna follow up and talk to you more about it, and see where we can go in terms of thinking about Black queer life. In, let's say, specifically in the spiritual Baptist faith, and it's something I'm still working through as I try to write this, book. But queer in one sense, and sort of Black queer life in one sense, and the way that it shows up, in that along the lines of kind of Nadia Ellis's Territories of the Soul, when we can think about queerness as anything, again, going back to Quare and E. Patrick, but a way to think about this sort of non-normative posture, something that steps outside of expectations, that which is in excess, thinking about the possibility for religion to hold so many traditions together. So hold Hinduism, hold Yoruba traditional practices, hold something they're calling Kabbalah, all in the same breath, that so that those the amalgamation of those practices is a queer kind of spirituality that makes sense for Black queer folks, because we're often holding things that are thought to be contradictory altogether seamlessly. And I think Omi would, say that, and in heels, if we're Black queer femmes too, on top of that, so that there's that possibility there that is already queer in terms of thinking about those traditions and not those definitive lines between different kinds of religious practice that can happen in various Creole religions, right? So that you might see in Vodou where people are, saying that they will tell you that they're Catholic, but then are also practicing Vodou, and there's no contradiction for them, although they may tell a researcher who's not deep in the religion enough, or somebody who's practicing Yoruba practices, was Ifa initiate, but that might not initially say more about how they're using Congo in the way that they're practicing, so that there's a way that those things being connected to each other is very sort of quote unquote new world, and the new world is very queer, and also gives us lessons, indicates in the ways that the sort of quote unquote old world, and when I say old world, I mean Africa, but thinking about the African continent as already a sort of amalgamation of different kinds of religious traditions that created these traditions that we know that come with folks and then get mixed, right, in those different kinds of ways. Now, also, going back to Kevin Kwashi, just thinking about it's a space though for us to, when I think about Black queer folks and the difficulties, some of the difficulties I had and still have with some of the folks who are part of these traditions, like in the churches, church leaders, things that I go to, is that we can also be part of recognizing kind of Black queer presence in those spaces, is allowing space for the kind of messiness and the violence and the difficulty of the ways that we are. And so I hold that space for Black queer folks, which doesn't feel like the kind of positivist, what people call, Afro-optimist space where everything is lovely and glorious, but that we can also be messy and we can be violent and we can be using these traditions in order to do harm to other people, just like anybody else and any other practice, right? From Catholicism on down to wherever, like people have these presumptions about, justice and being done wrong and so like the ways, so it was difficult. It's been a challenge for me to see Black queer folks using spiritual practices to do a whole host of things that any other human people do with religion, but my expectation was for a different kind of for queer folks to show up differently, which I think is naive of me. I have to admit. And so that's been a big challenge in terms of seeing Black queer folks just being human in those religious traditions, right? And doing all the messy things and some of the beautiful things that human beings do, but having space for that, right? And not trying to focus only on the kind of things that I deem more positive or more helpful. And I think that we already, in terms of I like the Afrofuturist sort of construction even more now, although, gotten all this popularity, but only because as I move away from sort of this thing called Black queer studies too, because I feel like if I move away from Black studies, I also got to move away from this thing called Black queer studies. And what do I call it? Like Afro-queer studies? I'm still trying to figure out what that is, but Afrofuturism helps me to think about the ways that we are always planting the seeds of the future, of the to come, in these moments that are now. And so Afrofuturism, as folks will say, is the now, right? So the messy things that the Black queer folks are doing within these traditions is also a roadmap for how we might be better in the future or how we might be worse in the future, right? Not presuming that the future is going to be this utopia, but that it's just a roadmap to show us like where we might be going. And so I see that the way that people are, the way that Black queer folks are in this tradition is an indication, for better or worse, of the future we may have as Black queer folks in faith, as Black folks in faith, as faithful folks who are attentive to sort of Black traditions.
Thank you for that. And we're a little bit over time, but I want to give an opportunity to JT to respond to the question, and then we can close out the session.
I'll just say it's built in. I think it's built in a format, you know, currently that does not put it at the front or at the kind of, you know, the pinnacle of their power, but that's part of the kind of decolonizing work of those spaces is to help unleash the other forms of power that are sequestered under that primary form in order to find other modes of collectivity and futurity out of that, that include, you know, again, the other kinds of traditions that are subsumed to that hierarchy and to the violence that attends to that hierarchy, but that are not coextensive with it. And to really, I think that's the task, is to try to pull that out and to recognize where it's a fundamental part of the architecture in all the kinds of ways that people know, but a sequestered part of that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Thank you so much, Dr. Bouchama, for your moderation. Thank you, Dr. Lyndon Gill and Dr. Meredith Coleman-Tobias, Dr. J.T. Roan, and Dr. Omishele Tinsley, for all you have offered us through this conversation. We have passed through the graveyards and gardens of queer, quare, and quare, and Black studies together. I am grateful for this journey of spirit and hope for its forever now. Please look forward and out for the future of this work. It's our hope to publish this discussion. And again, my deep thanks, my gratitude to all of those who have participated in the organization of this, to Black Studies at Queens, and to each of you. Thank you for joining us. Take care.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Queens. Everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Bianca.
Thanks, Jen.